that's probably one of the most unnerving things about it, is that, everything you do is new. Raising capital is new. Hiring a CFO is new. Building a sales force is new. Everything's new, and you start to, everything is, everything takes longer to do than it does later on. Now these things are pretty obvious to you.
Welcome to Tweener Talks, a weekly podcast by builders for builders, where we explore the startup journey from the idea to the exit and all the lessons in between, with an exclusive focus on founders from the Triangle region of North Carolina. Now here's your host, serial founder and general partner of the Triangle Tweener Fund, Scot Wingo.
Welcome to this episode of Tweener Talks. This is the first of my two-part interview with Mike Doernberg. Mike is one of the most prolific multi-time founders in the Triangle. He moved to North Carolina when he was 15 from the Northeast, and then went to NC State for an accounting degree. But just being an accountant was not what he had in mind. He got the entrepreneurial bug and started his first company in the mid-90s called Marathon. Then there's a string of companies he started: SmartPath, Reverb Nation, which spun out AdWorks, and it also spun out Playmetrics. In this first part of Mike's story, we go all the way from those early days through to the end of SmartPath, which had a really interesting exit, and I think there'll be some fun stories in there that we'll cover. A lot of that was new to me, so it was great to sit down with Mike and go through it. I also learned a ton of operational tips from Mike. He's kind of an operator's operator, whatever that means. He's very good at operations in startups. He thinks about things holistically. He's very strategic and tactical. And just listening to the way he talks and thinks about things is always very helpful to me. And I learn something from him every time we talk. And I learned a ton from this interview, and I hope you do as well. First, a huge thank you to our gold sponsors. Today, we are featuring Ballantine. Ballantine is a boutique wealth management firm focused on serving entrepreneurs, business owners, and their families across generations. We'd also like to recognize our silver sponsors. Today, we are featuring Bank of America. Bank of America's transformative tech group provides the stability and scalability that tech companies need to rapidly grow today and into the future. Thank you again to all of our sponsors for supporting Tweener Talks and the entire Triangle startup community. It takes an ecosystem to build a thriving community, and sponsors like these are very valuable, and they contribute their time and also help sponsor things like the Triangle Tweener Talks and Triangle Tweener Times. Thank you. Mike Doernberg, welcome to the Triangle Tweener Talks podcast.
Thanks, Scott.
I'm excited to have you. You and I have known each other forever. You're one of the OG founders in the Triangle, and our schedules, you're also very busy because you're still an operator. And you've been so busy, it's been hard to get you on the pod, so I'm glad we could finally make this work out.
Yeah, I think that get a little older, couple knee surgeries, plus a little work. It's a little tough.
Yeah, totally understand. We had to have your knee in good shape for this podcast.
Long enough to sit.
Or at least you off pain meds. I guess on pain meds, you can be a little dangerous.
That's when you should have had me.
I think I've known you since, I was looking at this, I want to say 95, 96, somewhere like that. You're like one of the first folks I'd met way back in the day. And our offices were near each other over off of Airport Boulevard, if you remember that.
What company were you running back then?
That was Stingray. Yeah.
God, we go way back, Scott.
We're also big Star Wars fans, so we've been to many Star Wars movies together, which is fun.
Well, thanks to you.
We got to go. We got to go in May. It's Mandalorian and Grogu, so we got to go get the fams together and go see that.
That would be amazing. That's one of my favorite. That's one of my favorite sort of modern, sort of new versions of Star Wars.
But this is not a Star Wars podcast. This is Triangle Tweener Talks. So let's go all the way back. And where are you from? You don't have a Southern accent. I know that much.
I do not. I was born in Brooklyn. I grew up primarily in Connecticut. My family moved me down here when I was 15. There were three places that my dad was thinking about going. We were either going to move to Boulder, Colorado, which would have been pretty good because I like to ski. We were going to move to North Carolina, or we were going to move to Buffalo. I think I ended up on the right side of that. So we ended up moving to Winston-Salem. I finished high school here, went to NC State, and I've been pretty much here in the Triangle ever since, other than a short stint in Charlotte.
And then where'd you go to school? What'd you study?
NC State, studied accounting. I was a CPA for my first 7 years out of school.
Like on the public accounting audit side? Or?
I worked in our entrepreneurial services group, and which I originally started in tax, and then I did tax for a while, and then I moved into the entrepreneurial consulting group, which did a sort of a smattering of different things, everything from tax to a lot of startup types of things, a lot of venture capital companies. That's sort of where I kind of got my first exposure to kind of the world.
So that's an unusual. I don't think I've met any entrepreneurs that have started as a CPA. So how did that get you into entrepreneurship?
I think I was always going to do it. When I was young, I was always sort of wired towards the idea of entrepreneurship. And so even when I was at E&Y, which was an amazing sort of learning experience for me, I think it taught me a lot about a lot of the things I still use today. I learned at E&Y, but it was always a very unnatural place for me to think about staying for my career. And so I was watching, what was happening is I was working with a lot of the kind of young companies in the area. I remember working with Dave Babson, Ken Romley, who were running Burl software. And I worked very closely with them on that startup, as well as other entrepreneurs in the area. And I always, sort of envied the fact that they were building things. They were, innovating. They were always passionate and excited about the things they were doing. So for me, it became a magnet. It lured me very quickly to the other side. So as soon as I had an opportunity, I took it. And, so I think it was always a place I was going to end up. But I think having that front row seat back then both gave me confidence to do it, but it also kind of really kind of spurred me to do something sort of before I turned 30. And that was a big motivator.
So a lot of accounting people, and you've been there a while, they get on that partner path, and it's kind of like this, the accounting firms use it as this very lucrative carrot to kind of keep you on the path. What was there some entrepreneurship in your family, or like what about that itch of I want to go build something was different than getting on this super lucrative partner path? I don't know about you, but for me, I never really thought about starting a company or running a company because I wanted to make a lot of money. It was always very natural for me to go. It was almost a foregone conclusion that I was going to do it. I think for me, I've always been a pretty curious person. So, being exposed, especially back then, I know around that time, the internet was just starting to become a thing. And there was a lot of change going on. Early on, PCs were just starting to become common in the workplace. So it was a very natural time to start thinking about innovation. There was a lot of change going on. And so the idea of being partner was never really something I wanted to do. Now, if you talk to my wife or my mom or my in-laws, they would say differently. They thought I was pretty dumb for starting my first company. They wanted me to, they thought partner track was a good thing, but I never could see myself there. So it was never really, there was never real tension between, staying at E&Y or doing something entrepreneurial. It was always a very obvious choice for me. I think had I known it was going to be as hard as it was, I'm not sure I would have made the same decision. I'm glad I did, but it's definitely a difficult path. So I actually didn't know. I knew you were connected to Babson because I met you at the SmartPath days, and maybe even earlier. But what were they doing at their? Tell me what they were doing at their company.
So Burl Software was focused on the year 2000 problem. They were essentially ingesting COBOL source code, parsing it, and building basically an object database that they could query and ask questions, things like, show me where variables are defined, show me where variables are modified. So you could answer questions like, hey, year 2000 is coming up, show me all the places where dates are modified because we need to fix that. And they had built Burl, and during that time they had sold it to a company called Micro Focus. So I watched them go from startup, hiring, growth, and ultimately exit. Which was, and it's funny because a lot of the people that worked, I worked with Dave and Ken in my first two companies, but many of those people, the original software developers, are still with me today. And, Chris Lynch, who, was the attorney on the other side of the Burl transaction. And they had a participation clause in the venture capital agreement, when they finished, they actually pulled out the participation. It was liquidating participating preference. They pulled out, and Dave called it the unfairness clause because he didn't really like the fact they were stripping off the first money off. And we decided that Chris would never be on the other side of our transaction again. And Chris has been our attorney ever since.
Was it consulting, or was it actually a product they would license so people could do their own remediation?
Yeah, they sold the product as a product. They sold. I don't know what the exact pricing model was or licensing, but yeah, they sold it to some large big Fortune 5,000 companies, and they used it in their remediation of year 2000. So this was like 93, 94. So there was plenty of time to solve the problem. So they what they looked at was there was trillions of lines of COBOL code out there, and it needed to be managed. And then year 2000 came along, which became a very, very sort of compelling reason to, kind of way to market and sell the product.
So did you go to work for them there, or then update you on the timing of when all this kind of came together?
So I didn't work for them. We were doing tax and audit work for them. I just became very close with them. And so, I was very close, sort of friends of the company, so to speak, through that period of time. So when I went and I started my first company, which was Marathon, which was a consultancy, I was pretty early on. Within a couple of years, I went back. I wanted to start a software arm of that business, so I went back to Dave and Ken, and and convinced them to come and join me. And they essentially became, they weren't founders, but they came in very early, and we ended up building Marathon till we sold it in 99.
So were you successful? That's an interesting, because one of the things I've learned about the Tweener list is many of the software companies in the triangle that bootstrap off the back of consulting, right? So they build this relatively lucrative consulting business, and as they're doing it, they have all these at-bats solving some problem, like maybe even the year 2000 problem back in the day. They realize there's an opportunity to build software to solve that problem. They build the software, dog food it, and then they license it. And that's probably our biggest one is Prometheus. I don't know if you know those guys, but they did a unicorn through that. Eric Wong there. So is that kind of how Marathon worked? You were doing some consulting and then found an opportunity? Yeah,
it was a little bit different than that, but I think the general sort of idea is pretty true. Marathon was every company starts, usually for me anyway, starts because there's some inflection point. There's something going on. And for me at the time, and this is sort of 94, 95, PCs were starting to become really, really prevalent in the workplace, and they were starting to play roles beyond sort of back office functions. They were, in this particular case, they were starting to play a role in graphic design and publishing. And you were starting to see marketing come in-house, or I should say marketing design come in-house. And so we became an systems integrator around that, doing, high-end networking. We were doing sort of packaged software implementation, and then we were doing sort of, hardware and software sales. That sort of led very naturally to the idea of people want to start building websites. So we built a web consulting company, starting to do initially there were big websites, and later on became the early commerce sites. So we did, for example, Wrangler. We did some work for Nike. We did, a variety of different things, everything from like really high-end sort of graphic stuff like National Geographic to business stuff for VF Corporation. And we started to cut our teeth on building internet applications. And that was the basis and ultimately the reason the company sold, because in 99, everybody wanted to get into strategic consulting. And so we ended up selling that business. But before that, we had a project with GlaxoSmithKline And we were solving some workflow problems they had on inside the organization. They had this sort of proliferation of marketing programs that they had because they had taken so much stuff in house. All of a sudden, instead of doing one big ad campaign, they were doing many, many, many digital campaigns. And that became a problem to manage. And so we built essentially operational software to manage the documents, to manage the workflow processes across their disparate organizations and across their supply chain. That became the basis that we ended up building a product. And then when we sold Marathon in 99, we spun off the technology that ultimately became SmartPath. Ken Romley ran that company for about a year and a half while Dave and I went to work for the acquiring company. And then I came back to lead the company, after I left the acquirer. And then that sort of, and then we ended up running that company we sold SmartPath in late 2004.
So you've done, this is going to be a pattern. So spoiler alert for those listening. You have this, another thing you've done that's kind of unusual is you're really good at finding these other opportunities and spinning them off. And that's usually, I don't know if you do this too. Usually I'll meet a first time founder and they'll get a company up to like $1 million. And then they're like, I want to go into 6 more markets. And usually I'm telling them, no, don't do that. But you've actually had success at that. Why? What was your intuition? You must have been, super young. Like what was the logic and why do you think it worked when a lot of times this kind of thing doesn't work?
That's a great question. I think I have a pretty healthy fear of failure. And, for me, focus is critical. I still believe this. I am having conversations internally about this now, which is when do you start to press the gas on things that are more forward-looking, where you're starting to expand TAM? And I'm always reluctant to do that because it can be highly distracting to the organization. They start chasing the shiny object. In the case of SmartPath, we very early on said, if we're going to build a product, we need to completely isolate the development of that product. It needs to have its own people. It needs to have its own everything. And so when we committed to build SmartPath as a product inside of Marathon prior to spinning it off, we committed to it as a product because building a product in a services company are very different. And so what we did was we separated it from the beginning, and then it became very easy to spin it off because it was separate. And I would say we did the same thing when we did AdWorks later on inside of E Minor, which had the bigger company, which is Reverb Nation. And so that became sort of the model for how we did it. So if we did decide we were going to make an investment, there was a natural point where you would say, look, this business needs to not be part of the core business. Let's make sure we give it the money, make sure we give it the people, make sure we give it the sort of the expectations that it's going to be separate. And I think that that's worked pretty well for us, is really to kind of from the very beginning think about it as a spinoff in every respect, even down to the way we contract for things. We, for example, created a separate legal entity pretty early on to support that. So just things like that. I think but you're right. It's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing to do too many things.
Probably one of the differences, you were further along. And also maybe this is like some of your accounting background helps you here because you can you're more analytical and you can say, this is a different business, right? There's, it's different customers, different go to market, different billing, the whole thing is different, right?
Yeah, I mean, it has different metrics, it has different, it even has different skill sets that it needs internally. I mean, you think about, the difference, you think about building a software product versus building a custom software for somebody, very different problem. And, you need to think about everything from requirements gathering to, so design very differently. So yeah, it's different in every respect. What's common about it is that you have exposure to the problems through, and deep exposure to the problems where you can understand the problems sort of very intimately, much better because it's happening right in front of you in the things you do every day. So in the case of SmartPath, we were working with GlaxoSmithKline in all kinds of ways. So we had a front row seat to what was happening. So it became we knew all the people there. We understood how information moved through their organization. We understood what tools they were using and why they weren't working. And that became a very sort of powerful way to think about building a product. Of course, the problem that you end up with is that if you do that, you end up building a product that's for an N of one. So the other thing you have to do is you have to look past your kind of current, customer, and you have to say, okay, how does this apply broadly? Can you build it? Can you abstract it in such a way it can be used by other companies? Do other companies have the same problem? Will they pay for it? And those become things you need to consider pretty early on.
What was the technology, and did it actually accept credit cards?
Let me think. That's been so.
Because this is kind of in the
yeah. So what do we do? The first commerce site. Well, the first website I think we did was the Wrangler Western Wear, and it was pretty much a stylized version of cowboy life. It was cool and it was nice, but it was much more an advertising set. I'm trying to think of the technology that we built it in. Honestly, Scott, I think it might have been a C++ back end.
It probably, I think the early .NET was like some of the earliest websites, but it was like it wasn't really, it was built for client server, and then just like having it run a website was like very fragile because it couldn't handle all the connection requests. It was built for, a server and maybe 100 terminals or 100 PCs or maybe 1,000 PCs, and then they'd fall over. It just wasn't really designed for like modern.
I think the thing from a commerce standpoint, it was pretty basic back then. You took credit. There weren't a lot of people paying for things. I think the bigger, more interesting applications back then I think we built two that I remember being very, very, very sophisticated. The first was we built for Health Tech's children's clothes, which is a division of Wrangler. At the time, was a division of VF Corporation. So Wrangler, Lee Jeans, Health Techs were sort of the Janssen. I think was one of the brands back then. But Health Tech's children's clothes, they had a problem in that they were trying to sell children's clothes to very small retailers, and they never got around to selling them because they were always dealing with the big retailers. So by the time they were able to sell the small retailers inventory for the upcoming year, it was always very late, and they couldn't sort of factor it in because there were so many of them. And we built essentially an online version of their sales team, so they could basically do something called work the rack, where they would take a bunch of children's clothes and they could sort of put them out on the rack, and then the buyer could then see them and buy them. So we built a pretty nice version of that. Probably it'd be fun to look at it now and see if it was still nice. But at the time, it was pretty high end, and it ended up being really successful because they could, instead of sending people out to sort of these remote places, they could do it all online. So we built some nice applications that ended up being not just websites, but being functional applications that ended up solving real problems. And when we started doing that, that became a very informative experience, in terms of what the internet could be. Because at the time, I don't think anybody understood exactly what was possible. I think now we look back on it, it's pretty obvious, but at the time we were all trying to figure it out.
It was just like putting you into brochures digitally was exciting. We didn't even really think about transactions or social media or like any of the stuff we have today. Yeah. Do you ever wonder if you just like stuck to e-commerce, what would have happened?
I don't know. I never really liked e-commerce. You did.
You like big ACVs.
I do.
Tell us about the SmartPath journey. So you guys spun it out with this Glaxo thing is kind of an anchor idea of campaign management, marketing workflows. Like, how would you describe it in today's?
Yeah, really what SmartPath was really a low-code programming environment. Is really when I look back on it, it's what it was. It
was low code, very, very sexy for the era.
Well, we didn't know what it was. We didn't have a name for it back then, right? Maybe it wasn't low code. Maybe it was moderate code. We basically built our own sort of scripting language or tag language that allowed us to quickly build sort of objects and then workflows. It was pretty cool, and we used it because the problem with a lot of what we're doing in this sort of knowledge-based workflow is that all these workflows were a little different. Sometimes you would have to drop out of a structured process into an unstructured process, and you need ways to do that. That actually, it's funny, that experience has become very important to Playmetrics because we use a lot of the ideas that we learned back then. But the product was really cool. It's funny now when I look back on it, That's probably the single biggest mistake that I've made, is that we sold that company too early because the product was really special. We were young, and we didn't really understand what it could be.
Y'all had venture, right? If I recall.
We did. We had venture in all companies. So we bootstrapped Marathon, and then we got some venture financing sort of towards the end of that. And then it became, and pretty much every company since then has been venture financed at some level.
Was the venture in Marathon to do the SmartPath spinout, basically, or?
It was a little bit of growth and yes. I think it's fair to say it was primarily to build SmartPath.
And that was Bull City or South Cap?
No, that I would call that era. Let's call it the Marathon SmartPath era was Inner South.
Okay, Inner South money.
Yeah, yes, we did.
You had to go negotiate with Mitch and Kip and all those people.
They were, I look back on it and I think, we've had some pretty good investors, and Inner South at the time was, ended up being pretty good investors. And, I think we did well by them. And I think, they were good, and they were good for us at the time. So, they ended up coming in. I think we had in SmartPath later on, we had some of the angel groups in as well. I think we had Cap and TIG were both in, if I remember.
Tell the audience what it was like pitching to TIG.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to do that again.
It's kind of a rite of passage, though. Were they in the that Ebola place? I call it the Ebola place. It was like this old First Flight Center, and it was like from
it was
the 50s. I had like a 50s bomb shelter.
I do. It's funny. I would never remember that until you just said it. Yeah, it looked like a giant, kind of a big, oversized like school classroom with absolutely.
It was like wood paneling and stuff from it was literally from the 50s.
And then you have all these people that have, from all these different walks of life that want to be investing in sort of startups that all have a different set of questions. They all have a different perspective. They all want to give you advice. And yeah, it's not a great experience, great way to raise capital. But at the time, it was a source of capital.
It was a gauntlet. It was like a really good. They asked hard questions. Like some of them were like wacky and they didn't understand. So it was a gauntlet because it'd be like someone would ask a question they clearly didn't understand what you're doing. Because there was like a lot of doctors in there, and unless it was biotech, they had no idea what you're doing, and they would always say no to non-biotech. But then you'd have like Robbie or the Ed, and they would ask like a level 200 level software question. So you go like, this guy doesn't understand it. This guy's like ninja level. And it was just like this. It was very hard it was kind of Shark Tanky in a weird way. It was hard as an entrepreneur to get through that.
It was there. And there's another skill, I think, at least for me, that I didn't really learn it, but I definitely sort of had to learn it as like in the middle of the meetings, is that there's a dynamic in between the members of TIG or the thing. And so they start talking to each other, teaching each other, explaining to each other. And you kind of have to sit back and just sort of let them play it out.
Yeah, you can't inject yourselves because they need to kind of figure it out.
They need to, and then they get to. It's like more of a participatory, event.
Several of those I thought it was like the worst pitch I'd ever had, and they'd like, "We're in." I'm like, okay, I don't know how that happened. Or I'd do a good one at some of these angel groups, and they're like, "Yeah, we just can't." There's this one guy, and he's on the executive committee, and he's blocking it. There was some cell tower guy in my first company at TIG that blocked me. I probably remember his name. And he kept asking me, it was Stingray software. He's like, how is this like a cell tower? And I'm like, it 100% is not like a cell tower.
We are not a cell tower. There's nothing cell tower.
I can't think of any way to stretch software for C++ developers to cell phone towers. And he was like, I'm out. Okay. It's a lot easier. Even though it's not easy today, it's a lot easier, guys.
Yeah, it's a lot different raising capital now. And this is true too, as you start to have some success, it starts to get easier because that you in their mind, at least the management team tends to be de-risked. So I think that, it's, when you're young, we're in our 30s and we're raising capital, and, you just haven't learned the things that you haven't learned what you know now. And, I think that this is the thing. I think when you're starting your career as an entrepreneur young, there's so many things you don't know. And that's probably one of the most unnerving things about it, is that, everything you do is new. raising capital is new. Hiring a CFO is new. Building a sales force is new. Everything is new, and you start to, and everything is, everything takes longer to do than it does later on. Now these things are pretty obvious to you.
Let's kind of recap the SmartPath journey. So that's 2001 to 2004. How much money did you raise, and then how did the acquisition come about?
I don't remember exactly how much money we raised. I think it was maybe $2 or $3 million. It wasn't much. It was small. And
by today's standards, but back then that was, that's all you needed. A lot of times that's all you needed.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It was, I think with every sale of every company, there's been a catalyst that was external, typically interest. Most of the processes that we've entered into have been successful. The ones that have not have tended to be when we went too early or we were unprepared. So I think with Marathon, we had some inbound interest. That inbound, and everybody, the space we were in was pretty hot, and it became pretty obvious it was time to sell. It was sort of early 99. The internet was hot as fire, and we were doing some pretty sexy work. And if you were sort of in the consulting world, whether it was, I don't remember who it was, there were a bunch of different consulting firms at the time. You wanted to be in that business, and it was the time to sell. And as it turned out, later in 99, everything fell apart. So it was a good time to sell. We didn't know any better. We were just lucky. For SmartPath, we were partnering with DoubleClick at the time, and DoubleClick, asked us about acquisition. We hired a banker. We ended up running a process, but at the end of the day, we ended up selling to DoubleClick. So it was, again, catalyzed by, people who already knew who we were.
Yeah. Sometimes a business has a natural place it should be, and DoubleClick was the obvious home for what you were doing.
It was the obvious home for what we were doing, or what we needed to do was to raise more capital and sort of go much bigger, which I think probably would have been the right answer in retrospect. But, it's hard at the time when you have a chance to sort of see something through, notch the win, and then move on. It's hard sometimes to sort of, to say, no, we're not going to do that. Let's go. There was, and I think for that particular example was, that particular example made a lot of sense for us. Today, I think I probably would have other options. There would be a PE option. And the PE option sort of is a nice option because it allows you to de-risk, but it also allows you to keep going.
Yeah. Take a little money off the table too. Get a little liquidity, but not. Back then, it was all or nothing.
It was all or nothing, and you tended to sell to a strategic, and the strategic had designs on what they wanted to do with the business. Where the PE firm tends to want to operate, especially if you're the platform, wants to operate the business going forward. So I think there's more options today than I think there were back then, at least for a company the size we were.
And then, was that a good exit?
Yeah. I mean,
was it ever disclosed how much?
I don't remember.
It's been 21 years. You can say no. Statute of limitations. Give us a zone. Double digits, millions.
Oh yeah, it was millions. I think that the SmartPath deal ended up being around. I think Marathon was around 15, and then I think SmartPath was around 20 or 25. I know I should know this right off the top of my head, but I don't.
Well, a lot of times it's like squishy, right? There's escrows and.
I knew you were going to ask me, and here's what I can say to you: if I take all the exits and I merge them all together, it's around $500 million. Just that's all. That's what I'll say.
You're half a unicorn.
You're
the front half. You're the back half. Okay, so then you sell. How long did you do indentured servitude at DoubleClick? That was probably an interesting time because they were really in there. That was pre-Google acquisition, right?
Right. I think DoubleClick was going through some changes. I think they had expanded their business, and they had entered into sort of the marketing automation side of the business, which included us. They had a product called Dartmail. They had this data aggregation play that we were doing that they had done called Abacus. And I think that business, the core of that business was the ad serving business. And I think when Google came along, it became they needed to take the company back apart again. But it was a very natural place for us to sell. And I think later on, the DoubleClick strategy changed. They ended up selling the marketing automation division. They sold our particular piece to our largest competitor. And that became when I left. There was no place for me, given that we were being purchased by our competitor. So I think I was there, I want to say 15 or 18 months. I think it was 18 months. My contract hadn't ended, but it was close.
You get through DoubleClick and then you decide to retire.
I did. 3 months. 3 months. I went to Home Depot one day. I've told people this story, and I was at Home Depot to buy some screws, and I came back 3 hours later, and my wife asked me what I was doing. I said I was buying screws. When you retire and you have nothing to do and nobody to do it with, because you're still in your 30s, you go to Home Depot and you spend 3 hours talking to Ed about screws, and it was fun for a little while. But
you start thinking, it'd be kind of fun to work here.
I actually did.
I look good in an orange apron.
Look better than most of the guys there. So I thought you back then. It's interesting. After we sold Marathon, I took some time off. Dave Babson and I we hung out. We played golf every morning, and he taught me to code in the afternoon, and we started building what ultimately would become Reverb Nation later on. Or at least the ideas behind it. And, but I got bored, and so did Dave. You can only play golf, but so much. And I think the same thing was true after we sold SmartPath. There wasn't anything to do. I didn't enjoy having that much time, and I wanted something to do. And so for me, I always wanted to go back to doing what I loved, which was, building things, working with people I love working with, solving interesting problems. And, so I've never, ever since then, I've never taken really any time off because it's just not something I wanted to do.
You and I are in this bucket of this company building is addictive, and there's nothing else that kind of even comes close to the satisfaction that you get from doing it.
I think that's right. I also think, and I'm sure this is true with you as well, and I know it's true in Tweener, I know it's true in the things that I do, is that you end up developing these relationships with people they're your friends, but they're also the people that you do this with, that you have interesting whiteboard conversations, and you think about the future, and you talk about how things fit together, and you start to talk about things that are happening, and you talk about how you might, and these become you incubate ideas together. And there's something about that experience, the people I work with, that I don't want to give up.
And you get to pick them. It's like one of the few times in life you get to kind of say, right, you can't pick your family. And if you work at E&Y, you can't pick your coworkers.
That's
you can
right.
kind of move around, but there's always someone you don't get along with. And you're kind of a hothead, so there's probably a lot of people you don't get along with. So
you're also doing the things that company has set out to do. You haven't established your own path.
And if you disagree, it doesn't. I'm the kind of person, this is why I could never work for a big company. If the company I'm working for does something stupid, I'm going to tell them. And that doesn't really work well.
Well, I think you and we work at we have a different pace, right? I think there's a different pace. For example, if you're not getting something right, you're going to kind of open up your computer and you're going to start writing code, or you're going to get a spreadsheet out, and you're going to start spending all night, and you're going to figure it out. And then you're going to walk in the next morning and you're going to show everybody. And that's the way you work. You're not. So part of the problem of building a company, for me it is anyways, as we get bigger, you're less hands-on. And so now you have to learn how to work differently. That's probably the thing I'm going through right now, which is, how do I learn to work differently? How do I learn to work in a bigger company? How do I learn to sort of ask people to do things or direct them as opposed to doing myself? But the idea of what we do, there's nothing else that really compares to it. There's not, and it isn't about the seriousness. It isn't about the money. It's really just about the people, and it's about the innovation, and about like sort of thinking through problems. It's a unique situation, and we're very fortunate that we get to do it every day.
For more Tweener content, check out the Triangle Tweener Time Substack at tweener.substack.com. For more Tweener content, check out tweenertimes.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon on Triangle Tweener Talks.